the goggles on. So like Anthony, I'm also part of the old furniture here at the AIC, and like Rick was also 4 years old in 1973, so old on all fronts, and hence the goggles today. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the National Deaths in Custody program. I head up the stats team, or the statistical collections team at the AIC, as well as the Indigenous Justice Research Program. AIC has probably not done monitoring for the whole of its 50 years, but we certainly have been in the game for a considerable proportion of that time, and it was really heartening to hear today that there was a real push to reintroduce statistical collections into the AIC, because I'm a firm believer that statistical collections and monitoring data are really important for crime and justice initiatives, and we've done an incredible job in terms of administering a number of collections over the last 20 to 30 years. Here's just a sample of those that we've looked after, are currently looked after, or recently have evolved within the AIC. Amongst the retired is the Drug Use Monitoring in Australia program. Many of you will be familiar with JUMA. It was recently retired in the last couple of years after a fantastic 20-odd years, collecting data around drug and criminal offending amongst police detainees across Australia. There was a National Fire and Theft Monitoring program. It was a short endeavour, 4 years, just to understand what was happening around fire and theft, and particularly around the theft of both licit and illicit firearms, the National Armed Robbery Monitoring Program, as well as the Juvenile Detention in Australia. Then there's a group that I like to call the Marathon Runners, the National Homicide Monitoring Program, which has been around for 30-odd years. It's about to have its time in the sun again, which is fantastic, with all its work around intimate partner homicide, etc. The National Deaths in Custody Program, which I'm going to talk about today, as well as the Fraud Against the Commonwealth program, which was obviously spearheaded by Dr. Smith. And then we have our new kids on the block, the ASOS, we always talk in acronyms here, the Australian Sexual Offences Statistical Collection, the very new Human Trafficking and Modern Slavery National Minimum Data Set, which we're both very excited about each of those, and of course the Australian Cybercrime Survey that Anthony mentioned, which is also a new kid on the block and which has already produced fantastic results. So I am very aware that I'm talking about Aboriginal deaths in custody after the outcome of the referendum. So we'll talk with great sensitivity around this particular issue today. As we all know, there was a Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, which the AIC was very much involved in terms of collating some of the information that was reviewed as part of the Royal Commission, which investigated the causes and circumstances of 99 deaths of First Nations people between the 1st of January 1980 and 31st of May 1989, and examined a whole range of matters around those deaths, the characteristics, the criminal histories of the deceased, the cause, manner and place of the deaths, the custodial care, the investigations that occurred, the notifications around the death, and of course the overrepresentation in the criminal justice system. And the final report was released in 1991 with 339 recommendations. One of those recommendations was for the AIC to establish a monitoring program around deaths in custody, which was to collect statistics and other information on Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal deaths in prison, police custody and juvenile detention centres and related matters, and that to be monitored nationally and on an ongoing basis. And we have done so since that recommendation. So since then, we have collected information from police and corrections, as well as coronial information through the National Coronial Information System around all deaths in custody in relation to this definition. This is the Royal Commission definition. Sometimes we get asked questions about why our numbers don't really match other numbers that might be in New South Wales coroner's courts or what have you. That is because we work with the Royal Commission definition, and there are different definitions across the states and territories that are legislated by the coroners or are collated by police, etc. So just quickly, a death in custody is a death wherever occurring of a person who's in prison custody, police custody or detention, if it's caused or contributed to by traumatic injury sustained or by lack of proper care while in custody or detention, if the person dies or is fatally injured in the process of police or prison officers attempting to detain that person, and when they're attempting to escape from prison, police custody or youth detention. So as mentioned, we set up the NDICP in 1992. We're still going in 2023. And in that time, we have data from 1979-80 for all prison custody deaths that have occurred in Australia. We also have some data on police custody and custody-related operations deaths since the early 80s. But most of the really comprehensive data has come from the 1989 period. And in that time, we have had over 80 publications around deaths in custody, starting with this first one by Dave McDonald and Christine Hallett, assisted by Vicky Dalton, up until our most recent one, authored by Mary McAllister, who's here today, myself, and we will have our next report released at the end of the year, which will be authored by Mary and Hannah, who I'll introduce later on at the end of this presentation. So what do we know about deaths in prison custody and also deaths in police custody? So we've generally been looking at rates per prisoner population, and that's sort of been the conventional way I've been looking at, and we've been doing that up until recently. And this shows, and you'll know from the Royal Commission, that what they discovered is that Indigenous persons in prison custody were not necessarily dying at higher rates than non-Indigenous prisoners. The real issue, of course, which remains to this day, is the over-incarceration of Indigenous people in prison custody, and hence that higher risk of dying in prison custody. So as we can see, since 1981-82, that generally rates of both Indigenous and non-Indigenous prisoners in prison custody have declined, and considerably since the 2000s. Now, like with small numbers, you are going to get fluctuations over that period. We've had a little bit of an uptick with Indigenous deaths in the last couple of years, but for the most part, we have seen a reduction in both Indigenous and non-Indigenous deaths in prison custody in that time. But as said, we've also mentioned we'll also progress to measuring rates per 100,000 relevant population. And this is where you do see considerably higher rates amongst the Indigenous population. Relatively flat line for non-Indigenous deaths, both in prison and police custody. Obviously, we expanded that out. We'll see that it has fluctuated over that time. But if we look at Indigenous deaths in prison custody and police custody, again fluctuated over that time, but considerably higher rates when you look at total population in comparison to non-Indigenous. Just very quickly, in terms of the findings over the years, we do find that most deaths in prison custody are from natural causes. This is a contested space. Some will say no death is natural when it occurs in prison custody. We're actually embarking on a piece of work looking at natural cause deaths amongst Indigenous prisoners, and then another piece of work on non-Indigenous prisoners, just to see what are the circumstances of those deaths when there was the coroner had determined it was the natural cause. 6 in 10 of Indigenous deaths in custody are natural cause deaths, and half of non-Indigenous deaths. So it is a higher proportion overall amongst Indigenous people that they are dying of natural causes. And the figure below just shows some of the rates where we're seeing the natural cause death continues to predominate as the primary form of death in prison custody, and a marked decrease in self-inflicted, which are predominantly hanging deaths, both amongst Indigenous and non-Indigenous prisoners. We've seen a levelling out of death rates amongst sentenced and unsentenced prisoners. That is for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous prisoners. As I mentioned, almost over a halving of hanging death rates. And most of the persons who are dying in prison custody have been sentenced for a violent offence. In terms of deaths in police custody, we do find that around half of Indigenous deaths are due to accident or misadventure. That's a lot of motor vehicle pursuits, foot pursuits, etc. I think people are really uncomfortable with the phrase accident or misadventure. This is a colonial term that we've adopted, but that essentially applies to those sorts of deaths. And around a third of non-Indigenous deaths are due to accident or misadventure or are self-inflicted. So we're actually having a high proportion of self-inflicted deaths amongst non-Indigenous persons compared to Indigenous deaths in custody. However, when we look at the difference between an institutional setting as compared to when they're being detained, a third of police custody deaths for Indigenous persons do occur in institutional settings, cells, back in the paddy wagon, etc., which is a fifth for non-Indigenous deaths. We do also see that Indigenous deceased are more likely to be charged with a theft or a good order good order offence. We did some work for ANSPA looking at police custody deaths, particularly in relation to what they were being picked up for prior to when they died in police custody, whereas non-Indigenous deceased are more likely to be charged with a violent or a traffic offence. And then just some stats around what we've seen around motor vehicle pursuit deaths, which have really declined since the early 2010s, particularly for Indigenous deceased. And then we've got police shooting deaths. We capture deaths both where the person has shot themselves or when police have shot the deceased. They really fluctuate over the time, but as you can see, we've had a bit of an uptick in the last year or two around police shooting deaths as well, and both for Indigenous and non-Indigenous. Indigenous people are generally less likely to die by a police shooting death compared to non-Indigenous, but it has levelled out in the last year of data. So just very quickly, and this is sort of a reflection, deaths in custody is a highly emotive political area and has been an ongoing and understandably national interest since the Royal Commission. And essentially, what I feel is the huge contribution of the National Deaths in Custody program is, and it's a phrase that was used at a femicide conference that I was at a couple of weeks ago, was around the importance of long-term quantitative data, which is really the backbone for your response. Everyone wants a number, and we have the numbers. We also have some of the context as well. But the beauty of the National Deaths in Custody is that we do have the strength of numbers. We can tell you how many Indigenous people have died since the Royal Commission, which is 555. I'm looking at my colleagues, that is correct. I can just see you through my goggles. Merrin, it's around that number. And then we can also talk to you about what's happening in terms of rates and trends and what have you, which is, again, the consequence of time series data. It is so critical to understand what's happening around deaths in custody with time series information. So you can show we have had a reduction in hanging deaths. We are seeing spikes in police shooting deaths, which hopefully will drop down again in the next couple of years. We can say most deaths in prison custody are due to natural causes, and with coronial information we can look at what are the circumstances of those natural cause deaths. What is also really critical, which is what Russell touched on as well, is the maintenance of highly quality authoritative data. And this is what the National Deaths in Custody program certainly delivers. We get data from 19 different data providers across police, corrections and youth justice, supplemented by information from the National Coronial Information System. We've got exceptional relationships with our data providers, and really, really important information that's coming through to them that we can verify multiple times over the course of a year, just to make sure that the data remains authoritative. We're also consistent. We collect the data like we did 30 odd years ago, but we do a little bit of evolution of the data set to be able to bring in different data items and be able to respond to requests from government. But critically is the objectivity of the analysis. This is an apolitical data set. We are not in the game of making political statements around deaths in custody. That is not our role at the AIC. We are an objective and independent analyser of the data, and that is what we have done consistently since the establishment of the National Deaths in Custody program. So just very quickly, because I'm never aware how long I'm speaking for, it's just some of the things that we've done, which has also met some of the challenges around National Deaths in Custody. It is 555, so I'm glad that I had that figure in my head. So we have had to respond to, in more recent years, about having, it's an unfortunate phrase, faster data around deaths in custody. And what that has transpired into is having three strains or streams of reporting, if you like. We have our annual reporting, which we've been doing for 30 odd years, with the most recent report up in the top left-hand corner, which, as I said, we're going to have the more recent report coming out towards the end of the year. We have a quarterly dashboard, and now we have a real-time dashboard. And this is what I call the hare and the tortoise of reporting. So the hare of reporting is our real-time and quarterly dashboards. So the Labor government, in the lead-up to the election, had as an election commitment that they wanted real-time reporting of deaths in custody. We worked to produce a dashboard around to get that data up as quickly as possible, but with a proviso that no death would go up on the dashboard until next of kin have been notified, absolutely critical, but it'd also be limited in the information that would be available, both in terms of ethical provisions, but also what is actually going to be available, and that we can say hand on heart is as accurate as it can be. So on the left-hand side is showing what we're doing with our real-time dashboard, which is comparing both Indigenous and non-Indigenous deaths, the cumulative total over the current year in comparison to the previous year. And this is the most recent cut of the data. And if I just go back, we've had 15 Indigenous deaths and 58 non-Indigenous deaths. We are still waiting for commitment from one jurisdiction for real-time reporting, so those deaths are a slight undercount at present. But with our other 17 data providers, we're getting that data in good time on an average 5 to 6 days after the death has occurred and able to get up on our dashboard, and we're able to meet that election commitment. The quarterly dashboard, just moving a little bit back in history, was when it really started this effort to try and get this data out more quickly. So we moved to a quarterly dashboard, and this is just a few cuts from the quarterly dashboard where we look at deaths in custody by both prison and police custody, by age, by sex, by Indigenous status, by the manner of death, by the legal status when we're looking at prison custody deaths, as well as the method of detainment if we're looking at police custody deaths. And this data are updated every quarter. It is quite an involved process. Merrin and Hannah have done a fabulous job in getting this work together, both maintaining the real-time dashboard as well as getting the quarterly data together. This will continue on in line with our real-time dashboard, obviously making sure that the numbers match up between them. But in terms of the tortures, and I think this is where the real value add does come to the National Deaths in Custody program, is when we can do those more considered pieces with the comprehensive data that we have to hand, and also being able to do a little bit more investigation of the coronial findings. And this is just a snapshot of some of the work that's been done over the 30 years: shooting deaths in police custody, motor vehicle pursuits, self-inflicted deaths in Australian prisons, a gender-specific analysis of deaths in custody, looking at 25 years of Indigenous deaths in custody following the Royal Commission, and also police custody and self-inflicted firearm deaths. That is really just a snapshot of the sorts of things that we can do. As I said, we're going to look on natural causes and look a little bit more about pursuit deaths. As motor vehicle pursuit deaths have dropped off, we are seeing a little bit of an uptick in foot pursuit deaths, and just seeing what the circumstances are around those. And then probably the final challenge that we have is being able to promote access and application. We have so much data out there, and we think it's really accessible and available, but we're still trying to find ways to be able to bring people in, to get to the data, to be able to report on that data, and to use it, be it the media, for policymakers, for those working in police and corrections, to be able to use that data as best they can. So we have snapshots that we do in our annual reports. We provide quarterly updates to all our data providers every time we release data on the quarterly dashboard. Another example, the information that we have on the quarterly dashboard, we have figures, but we have underlying data, so people can really interact with the data and get a sense of what's happening around method of detainment amongst Indigenous and non-Indigenous people who die in police custody. We have had really good interaction with our dashboards. This is a little bit of an excerpt from Samantha Jackson, our library manager, about the page views that we had around the real-time dashboard, which got also 330 plus media reports on the day of its release, and also trying to sort of engage with our media friends. I think Russell mentioned about that constant tension with getting media to report our data correctly, working with our friends at The Guardian, who have their own way of looking at deaths in custody, to report on our data authoritatively and use that information to be able to sort of explain the situation that's happening with deaths in custody in Australia. And just very quickly, at great risk of embarrassing my team, this is a fabulous group that work across the stats team. So from left to right, we have Hannah Miles, who works on homicide and deaths in custody, Merrin McAllister, who works on deaths in custody, ID crime and fraud against the Commonwealth, and a little bit of ASOS. Alice Giannoni, who's technically not in my team, but is in my team for the purpose of the Human Trafficking and Modern Slavery National Minimum Data Set. Myself, Emily Falconbridge, who works on ASOS and homicide and ID crime, and Tom Sullivan, who used to head up the JUMA and gently brought the JUMA into retirement, is now leading the ASOS work, as well as doing some work with Sarah Napier on adult sexual offending. So with that, I will hand back to Rick. That will not take you to deaths in custody. That will take you to all of Anthony's work. That little, I accidentally included that in the presentation. But if you do go to the link, you'll be able to get to our real-time dashboard, our quarterly dashboard, as well as the most recent annual report and all the fabulous data that we collect in the program. So thank you.